The drug thalidomide, prescribed to pregnant women in the late 1950s to alleviate morning sickness, caused thousands of infants to be born with malformed limbs, only 40% of whom survived infancy. It was by no means the first drug to cause harm to patients, but in the dawn of the age of television, it was among the first to have those ill effects broadcast to the world. Although the drug was never approved for use in the United States, it led to the passage of the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which required drug manufacturers to provide proof of the efficacy and safety of their drugs before approval. That sounds like a reasonable requirement with all the right intentions, but critics say it may have cost more lives than it saved. Prior to the amendment, it took an average of 7 months for a drug to get approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Today, it takes anywhere from 10 to 12 years, which is far too long to help most patients with life-threatening illnesses. So what can be done to improve the model for drug testing and approval without putting patients' safety in jeopardy? Today we'll hear from Professor Ariel Stern about her case entitled Adaptive Platform Trials, the Clinical Trial of the Future. I'm your host, Brian Kenny, and you're listening to Cold Call.
So we are all sitting there in the classroom.
The professor walks in
and they look up and you know it's coming. Oh, the dreaded cold call.
Arielle Stern's research focuses on the management of innovation in healthcare with an emphasis on the medical device and pharmaceutical industries. She is particularly interested in the intersection of the regulation, firm strategy, and economics of healthcare, all of which I think factor into this case. Arielle, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
So I admit, I had to go back and read a couple of the sections of this case more than once, only because it gets into, there's a lot of definitions that matter, and I'm going to maybe belabor that a little bit in the beginning by asking you to define some stuff as we go on so our listeners understand exactly the nuances of the case. But maybe you can start just by, setting up the case for us. Who's the protagonist and what's going on?
Absolutely. So this case is set in the summer of 2017, and our protagonist is Dr. Brian Alexander, who's a radiation oncologist over at the Dana-Farber Cancer Center here in Boston. He's also an associate professor at Harvard Medical School. And Brian is in the process of launching a new type of clinical trial, an adaptive platform trial. And what's interesting about this setting is actually the study design is in really great shape. So where we come in is at a point in time where some of the leading experts in the world and the country have already had their input on the study design, which is quite innovative. But the business model itself is still developing. And so that's where it makes a terrific HBS case.
So I'm wondering, what prompted you to write this case? Do you have a background in medicine or an interest in medicine?
Yeah, so there are a couple of answers. I actually started off as an undergraduate studying biochemistry, so I've been interested in the life sciences for quite a while. But my first interest in clinical trials in particular dates back to 2004 when my mother was diagnosed with cancer and was enrolled in a clinical trial for an experimental cancer therapy. It turned out that what we would later learn is that the drug in this trial was not actually effective for the type of cancer she had. But it took us at the time actually between 2 and 3 years after she'd finished her course of treatment to learn that drug didn't really have a long-term effect. So that was quite disappointing. And at the time, it really struck me that surely there must be a way to get this information more efficiently. This was before I had a PhD and before I'd thought deeply about clinical trial design. The more recent, the more immediate answer is that through the Harvard-MIT Center for Regulatory Science that I work with closely, I've had the opportunity to meet and to work with Brian Alexander, our protagonist, and have been just broadly excited about all the great work being done on clinical trial innovation here in Boston. The other thing that led to the case is that it dovetails really nicely with the work of the Kraft Precision Medicine Accelerator here at HBS. And the confluence of all of those factors really meant that this was a great time to write a case about clinical trial innovation.
That's great. So now comes definition time, I guess. So can you start, I guess, because the case centers around clinical trials for glioblastoma. Just tell us quickly what that is.
Yeah, so unfortunately, glioblastoma is a malignant and fast-growing form of brain cancer. It's relatively uncommon. It affects about 12,000 people in the United States every year, but that's actually far less common than a lot of the cancers that we hear about. The typical course of treatment for patients is also unpleasant. It involves brain surgery to the extent possible, followed by a course of chemo and radiation. despite that, there are very frequent recurrences. The prognosis is not good, so the 5-year survival rate for folks diagnosed with glioblastoma is in the single digits. So this is really quite a serious disease and one where there's a lot of public and individual enthusiasm for doing better by our patients.
Great. So it's a complicated landscape, but how do drugs get approved in the U.S.?
Yeah, so how many days do we have?
In 5 sentences or less.
So in a nutshell, as you mentioned in your introduction, the entire process can easily take over a decade. We think about 10 to 12 years from start to finish. Drugs start off in laboratories and universities and pharmaceutical companies in what we call the preclinical phase of research, where we're trying to understand how the drugs work and if they'll work in patients before we start giving them to patients. In order to start giving drugs to patients, the drug sponsor, which is typically a pharmaceutical company, will file what's called an investigational new drug application with the FDA in the United States. And that's followed by, so if that's approved, they get the green light to move ahead with clinical trials, and that's followed by what we call the clinical trial phase. That involves usually 3 phases of clinical trials. We can, go into more detail if you'd like, but all told,
it sounds like a long time
takes
and a
quite a
lengthy
while.
process, and it's not cheap, right?
It's not cheap. Estimates really vary on this one, and as you can imagine, the costs also are likely to vary. If you're dealing with a more severe disease where regular hospitalizations are necessary, the cost of clinical trials will certainly be much higher, but on average, we're talking about anything from hundreds of millions of dollars to well over $1 billion to develop a new drug. So this is serious money.
And that gets to issues that we've heard about before where, there's concern that pharmaceutical companies are only investing the research in the drugs that are going to pay off at the end, meaning drugs that treat conditions that affect many people versus a few, like in the case of glioblastoma.
Absolutely. And we have in healthcare economics a number of good studies that have actually shown precisely that. So without getting ahead of ourselves, I think that one of the concerns is that for relatively rare cancers, we are worried that because the potential market is small on the back end, we may not have as much research as we would otherwise see for much more prevalent diseases.
So there's a lot of room for improvement, a lot of room for business solutions maybe, and we'll get to those in a little bit. Another definition here, can you describe a randomized control trial?
Sure. So,
and this is the current method.
This is the current method. So the current method, as it turns out, hasn't evolved that much since it was conceptualized. So the original randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, actually go back exactly 70 years to 1948 when, believe it or not, when we did the first randomized controlled trials of streptomycin in tuberculosis patients. There's, of course, been a good deal of evolution in statistical software, but more or less the design has been unchanged. And we often think about a traditional randomized control trial as having 2 arms, so a treatment and a control arm, which is something a lot of folks will be familiar with. And what we do is we pre-specify the number of patients that are going to be needed to get statistically meaningful results out of this trial. And then what we do is randomize patients into either the treatment arm, where they would get some sort of experimental therapy, or the control arm, where they would typically get a placebo. Now, we don't use placebos in cancer trials for the obvious reason that it would be pretty unethical. So in cancer trials, what we usually do is compare an experimental therapy to what we call the standard of care. So the typically best available treatment for patients with that cancer. And then what we do is we randomize patients into each of the control arms and compare outcomes after one group has been treated and one group has either not been treated at all or been treated with the quote-unquote standard of care.
Yeah. So if you're in the wrong arm, that's not a good thing, right?
Well, so, with hindsight's 2020, if it turns out that the experimental therapy was incredibly powerful and incredibly successful, then the folks who were in the control arm really missed out in many respects on the opportunity to be treated with a better therapy.
Yeah. You spend a lot of time in the case describing the difference between like what kind of statistics they look at. Can you explain that? Because it's really important, I think, when you get into the adaptive trial platforms.
Absolutely. So I don't want to get too deep into our statistical appendices.
No, that'll scare away a lot of our listeners.
Don't want to scare away our listeners. But frequentist trials are those that basically set everything up in advance and, in a sense, kind of let it run, let it rip. And traditional randomized controlled trials are our frequentist trials. We do some statistical calculations up front, and we say, look, if we're expecting this type of effect from this drug, this is roughly how many patients we'll need to give it to in order to observe a statistically significant difference between our treatments and control groups. Bayesian trials, which are the basis for adaptive platform trials, are a little bit different. What Bayesian trials do is actually incorporate information as it accumulates. I'll give you an example. So say patients with a certain tumor type are doing incredibly well on a given therapy. What we can actually do is incorporate that information into how we assign patients to receive that therapy, and that'll work into the adaptive platform design.
So, and that also addresses the issue we just talked about, which is if you happen to be in the wrong arm of the study, then this gives you an opportunity to move.
Yeah. So what Bayesian randomization allows us to do is still maintain the statistical rigor that we want from trials, and really leads to causal inference, which is quite important. But it allows us to be smart about the size of the sample we're using, and how we're assigning patients.
Okay.
So.
All right, great. So now let's get to the meat of the case, which is the adaptive platform trial. Describe that in contrast to the randomized control trial.
Absolutely. So I think actually an example is helpful for this. There are two components. So there's the adaptive component and the platform component, and both are uniquely important in this trial design. Let's start with the platform since I think it's simpler. Conveniently, Brian, we have names that start with A and B, so we're going to imagine that we each have an experimental therapy. So I have experimental therapy A, you have experimental therapy B. And in the traditional clinical trial world, what would happen is let's say experimental therapies A and B are both for small cell lung cancer. Mm-hmm. What you would do is you would go out and you would enroll your trial, and I would go out and I would enroll my trial. We'd both have a control arm of patients who are not going to get this experimental therapy, either yours or mine. And we'd go out and we'd hire a contract research organization to help us run the trial. We'd pick an IT provider. We'd find patients and do all of that. And let's just say for simplicity that we both determine that we need 80 patients to get statistical significance in our trial. So you're going to have 80 patients, I'm going to have 80 patients. You'll put 40 of those patients on your experimental therapy, 40 will be on the control. I'll do exactly the same. Mm-hmm. So in that world, in order for you to get an answer about whether or not your drug works in these lung cancer patients, and for me to get an answer, we'll need a total of 160 patients.
Yeah.
What the platform trial does is just builds on this insight that if we can get it together in advance to coordinate on a lot of aspects of the trial infrastructure, we can actually share a control arm. So if we jointly choose a contract research organization that's going to go out and help us recruit patients, and if we jointly choose an IT provider and IT systems, we can silo off our individual information about the actual experimental therapies we're studying and share a control group of patients. So now, without doing anything else, we have just gone from needing 160 patients in total in order for us both to get statistical significance to needing 120 patients. Yeah. So the sample size has decreased. We're seeing efficiencies, especially in uncommon cancers. It's often hard to go out and actually find these patients. So 40% of cancer trials never fully enroll.
I was going to ask that because, you hear often that people who are desperate, no other treatments worked, and they're looking for experimental treatments.
Yes, absolutely, and so that's certainly all lurking in the background. And so what we want to do is when we have patients to use in clinical trials, we want to use them efficiently. And in this way, we have the exact same number. Both you and I have the same number of patients receiving the experimental therapy. So we have just as many patients who could potentially benefit from new drugs, but now fewer patients who are just in the control group.
Yeah.
So that's already more efficient. Then we can layer on top of that setup what we call Bayesian adaptive randomization. That's a mouthful, but what that means is that we're actually using Bayesian statistics that have been pre-specified for this trial to figure out how to efficiently assign patients to different arms of the trial. Mm-hmm. So, go back to my example from before. We have patients with a certain tumor type, and we learn that they are doing incredibly well on your therapy, on therapy B, based on interim analysis. So about once a month, we're going to actually look at the data and see how patients are progressing. We say, wow, patients of this type are doing really well on Brian's therapy. What we can do is use our pre-specified algorithm to now preferentially assign that type of patient to your arm of the trial. And patients love this. So now patients, as the trial progresses, patients are not only being used efficiently because of the shared control arm component of the trial design, but we've also got the patients that are coming in being preferentially assigned to the treatment arm of the trial they're most likely to benefit from.
Okay, so we've got efficiencies, we've got better patient outcomes. Those are two great things. What are some of the other benefits that emerge from using the adaptive approach?
So, thinking back to my mother's experience, the other thing we get is we get information faster on what won't work. And this is quite important, and it's something that I think we don't talk about enough. But what Bayesian adaptive platform trials allow us to do is we talk about trial sort of arm stopping and graduation. Graduation means that we learn very quickly that a trial is very effective, and we can move that drug on to the next phase. Stopping means that we also learn efficiently if a particular therapy isn't going to work for a group of patients. And surely it's desirable to stop researching that drug in that group of patients if we have a very good statistical signal that it's unlikely to help them.
So let's dig into some of the business challenges, because I was really fascinated reading about just how many people are involved in this and some of the really difficult business challenges that they faced in trying to get the trial up and running. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think a better question is sort of who wasn't involved in this. If you read between the lines in the case, what you'll actually see is that, in total, putting together just this one trial involved over 130 oncologists, pathologists, radiologists, and statisticians. This was a massively collaborative effort. It already has been, and the trial's only in the launch phase right now. We had a number of local folks at the Dana-Farber Cancer Center, as well as a number of individuals who are statistical consultants.
And some real entrepreneurial thinking about how you fund something like this. We talked about the money before. This real money that's required to do it, and they came up with some very interesting ways for how to fund it.
One of the benefits of an adaptive platform trial is we set up the infrastructure once, and then we can continue to add experimental therapies to the trial. But that's costly because we're building infrastructure for something that hopefully will last for many years, if not decades, until we have good treatments for glioblastoma. What that means is that the upfront costs are massive.
Yeah.
We have a lot of traditional financing options, so looking at things like asking pharmaceutical companies who typically fund clinical research anyhow to pay for individual arms of the trial. But the upfront costs are still quite an obstacle. In this case, the folks running the trial decided to start a foundation. So the foundation's called the Global Coalition for Adaptive Research. And through this foundation, they were able to start negotiating relationships with contract research organizations, and only then start to approach pharmaceutical companies and other cancer research groups to think about how they might want to be involved financially.
Yeah, I was particularly interested in the notion of them becoming a healthcare provider. That, to me, was really innovative.
While there's this really this daunting upfront challenge in financing, there are a number of new opportunities created here, of course, as well. One of the insights that Brian Alexander has had in thinking about this is, why not provide all of the health care for glioblastoma patients? We've got folks coming in anyhow. They're going to be seeing experts in both medical and radiation oncology anyhow. Why not just outsource all of the care for those patients to one of these trial sites and try to capture some of the value for patients and providers in that way? So that was one idea. The cost of doing a trial in glioblastoma for other experimental cancer therapies will go down once this platform exists.
Yeah.
You could also get really creative, and this is HBS after all, with thinking about other things that we might do. Just one example is that there are a lot of small biotechnology companies that have maybe only one or two experimental cancer drugs. And they've got the resources from their funders, typically venture capitalists, to run maybe only clinical trials in one type of cancer. Now, because we have this foundation, behind this research platform, the foundation can approach some of these small biotech companies and say, hey, look, we think your drug might be interesting to study in glioblastoma. Why don't you give it to us? We'll pay for that arm of the trial. We'll study your drug. And if it turns out this drug is effective, we'll have some sort of royalty sharing agreement on the back end. So now suddenly the foundation is able to take on some of the risk and then also have a piece of the action if it turns out that these drugs are effective.
Yeah. Have you discussed this in class?
I have. We've actually had a couple of events. We were able to discuss this at Boston's Hub Week event this fall, which was terrific. And then I also discussed this with a group of HBS healthcare alumni a couple months ago. They loved it. It's it's interesting. The folks who've worked in pharma, they have two reactions very rapidly. The first reaction is, wow, this makes so much sense. And the second reaction that follows predictably immediately on the heels of that is, I don't know if these companies will ever go for this. I don't, people who've seen what clinical research management looks like, they then right away say, oh, this is going to really freak people out. This is so different than how we've been doing clinical research up until now. And I think they're right, but I think that we're all going to be positively surprised.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian.
You can find the Adaptive Platform Trials case in the HBS case collection at hbr.org. If you enjoyed this episode of Cold Call, please subscribe on iTunes for more cases like this one. And while you're there, please write a review. I'm your host, Brian Kenny, and you've been listening to Cold Call.